Elias Stroud warned his new bride, the very evening he brought her home to the Aspen Fork, that his 6 grown sons would do their level best to run her off by sundown. He was right about the sundown. He was wrong about every season that came after, because by the time the deep snows broke the following spring, every one of those 6 hard, hostile men was calling the woman they had sworn to drive away by the only name that fit what she had quietly become to them: Mother. Elias Stroud was 64 years old and had been a widower for 9 of them, ever since his wife Naomi died and took the warmth out of the big house on the Aspen Fork. He had grieved her honestly and long, and he had told himself, the way lonely men do, that he was too old and too set for anything more. But a ranch house full of grown sons is a lonely place for an old man all the same, for the sons were busy with the work and their own hard company, and there was no one to sit with of an evening, no one who remembered him as anything but the old man who gave the orders. And on his trips to town he had fallen, slowly and against all his own expectations, into the easy company of a widow named Lydia Ford, who kept the boarding house in the valley town, and who was kind and quick and as lonely in her way as he was in his. They were neither of them young. They had each loved and lost, and they had decided with their eyes wide open that the years they had left would be warmer spent together than apart. And so Elias Stroud had married Lydia Ford in the little town church and brought her home to the Aspen Fork. He had not told his sons beforehand. That was his one great cowardice, and he knew it. He had told himself he'd present it as done rather than open it to argument. But the truth was, he'd been afraid of exactly the reception he knew was coming. Because the 6 Stroud sons, all grown men now from 20 to 32, had worshipped their mother, Naomi, and had built up her memory in the 9 years since her death into something close to a shrine, and they would see any woman their father brought into her house as an intruder, a gold digger after the ranch, a betrayal of the mother they'd lost. So Elias did the only honest thing left to him, which was to warn his new wife on the wagon ride up the Aspen Fork before she ever set foot in the house. "Lydia," he said, "I have to tell you what you're riding into, and I'm ashamed I didn't do it sooner. My 6 boys don't know I've married, and when they find out, they're going to be cruel. Not because they're cruel men underneath, but because they loved their mother fierce, and they've spent 9 years guarding her memory, and they'll see you as a thief come to steal her place." He gripped the reins. "They'll try to run you off. Tonight, if they can manage it, they'll be cold, and they'll be rude, and they may be worse than rude. And I'll stand by you and check the worst of it. But I can't make grown men's hearts feel what they don't feel. I'm asking you to bear it, and not to judge them by it, because there's good in every one of them, buried though it is tonight." He looked at her, an old man asking a hard thing. "Can you bear it?" And Lydia Ford Stroud, who had buried a husband and run a boarding house full of difficult strangers for 15 years, and was not made of anything, soft, looked up at the big house coming into view and said, "Elias, I have spent 15 years winning over hard, suspicious people who arrived at my door, certain they wouldn't like me. Your boys won't be the first. They likely won't be the worst. I didn't marry you expecting it to be easy. I married you because I'd grown fond of you and tired of being lonely, and I expect your sons are tired of being lonely too. Underneath all that anger, whether they know it or not, She squared her shoulders. "I can bear it. Let's go meet them." It was every bit as bad as Elias had feared, and worse. The 6 Stroud sons received the news that their father had married, and brought the woman home, without a word to any of them, with a cold fury that filled the big house like a draft. Bram, the eldest at 32, hard and proud, and the unofficial leader of his brothers, said things to his father that evening that should never pass between a son and a father, and said worse things sidelong, meant for Lydia to hear, that she was after the ranch, that she'd buried one old man's money already and come hunting another's, that no woman would ever take their mother's place at that table or in that house, and that she'd do well to be gone by morning. The others took their lead from Bram, as they always did. Cold stares, turned backs. The supper Lydia cooked that first night left untouched on their plates as a deliberate insult. 6 grown men making it as plain as men can make it that she was not welcome and never would be. Elias's face went gray with shame and anger, and he started up to lay into them, but Lydia put a hand on his arm. "Let it be tonight," she said quietly. "They're grieving a thing they think they're losing. You can't argue a man out of grief." And she rose and cleared the untouched plates without a word of reproach, and said only to the cold room, "There's coffee on the stove if anyone wants it, and I'll have breakfast at 6. Good night to you all." And she went up to bed and left 6 astonished men staring at the door, because they had braced for tears or for a fight, and gotten instead a calm that they had no idea what to do with. That was the shape of the first weeks. The sons did everything grown men do, to drive off an unwelcome woman short of laying hands on her. The cold silences, the deliberate rudeness, the small cruelties, the constant, unspoken message that she was an intruder who would never belong. And Lydia met all of it the way she'd met 15 years of difficult boarders, with an unbothered, unwavering, unkillable kindness that gave them nothing to push against. She cooked them good meals, whether they thanked her or not, and they did not. She kept their mother's house clean and warm without ever once presuming to move a single one of Naomi's things, because she understood, where a lesser woman wouldn't have, that the way to a grieving son's heart was not to replace his mother, but to honor her. She never raised her voice, never wept where they could see, never gave them the satisfaction of driving her to the breaking point they kept pushing toward. She simply, steadily, stayed and was kind and waited. Elias watched, half in agony, half in awe. "They'll come round," he kept telling her, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "Give them time." "They'll come round," Lydia agreed, "when something happens that they can't argue with, kindness they can ignore. They've had 9 years of practice, ignoring everything but their own grief." She was wiser about men than their father was. "It'll take more than kindness. It'll take a day when they need me and find me there. Men like your sons don't change their minds. They change them when their hearts get ambushed." The ambush came in January, and it came for Bram. The eldest son, the hardest of them, the ringleader of every cruelty. Bram Stroud rode out into a bad cold morning to bring down stock from the high pasture before a storm, and somewhere up in the breaks his horse went down on the ice and rolled, and Bram came out of it with a leg broken bad below the knee and a head knocked half senseless, alone in killing cold, miles from the house, with the storm coming on. It was hours before his horse came back riderless to the barn, and the household understood that something was terribly wrong. And it was full blizzard by the time the brothers, frantic, fought their way up into the breaks and found Bram half frozen and barely conscious in the snow, his leg a ruin, and got him down the mountain on a travois through a whiteout that nearly killed them all. To find, when they finally reached the house, that the nearest doctor was 40 miles off and snowed out, and would not be reaching the Aspen Fork for days, if at all, and it was Lydia Stroud who saved Bram Stroud's leg, and very likely his life, because Lydia had not spent 15 years running a frontier boarding house without learning how to handle the broken bones and fevers and accidents that came through her doors when no doctor was near. While the 6 brothers stood useless and terrified around their senseless eldest, Lydia took charge, calm, certain, fearless, and she set that shattered leg with her own hands, a thing that takes a strength of nerve most people never find, working by lamplight while the storm screamed, doing the brutal necessary work of pulling the bone true and splinting it sound. And when the fever came, as it did, hot and dangerous, she nursed Bram Stroud through it, sat by him day and night for the better part of 2 weeks, cooling the fever, fighting the infection, never leaving his side, tending the man who had been cruelest to her, with a devotion that asked nothing and spared nothing. The 5 other brothers watched her do it. They watched the woman they'd spent 2 months trying to drive off refuse to leave their brother's side. They watched her save the leg the doctor would surely have taken, save the life the cold had nearly claimed, and do it with a competence and a tenderness that none of their cruelty had earned, and that she gave anyway. And something began to break in them. The hard shell of grief and suspicion they'd built around the intruder, cracking under the simple, unanswerable fact of what she was doing for their brother. But it was Bram himself who broke first and hardest. He came up out of the fever on a clear, cold morning, weak and clear-headed, and found Lydia asleep in the chair beside his bed, worn to nothing from 2 weeks of tending him, her hand still resting on his splinted leg, as though she'd fallen asleep checking it. And Bram Stroud lay there and understood, all at once, and with the terrible clarity of a man who's been near death, the whole shape of what he'd done and what she'd done in return. He'd called her a thief. He'd left her suppers untouched to insult her. He'd done everything in his power to drive her from the house. And she had set his bones with her own hands and sat by him for 2 weeks and saved his leg, and never once thrown a word of it back in his face. When Lydia woke, Bram was watching her, and there were tears on the hard man's face that had nothing to do with the pain in his leg. "Why?" he said hoarsely. "After everything I said to you, everything I did, why didn't you just let the doctor handle it? Let me lose the leg? Why would you sit here 2 weeks for a man who tried to run you out of his own house?" And Lydia Stroud looked at the eldest son and answered him gently and completely. "Because you're Elias's boy," she said, "and I love your father, and that makes you mine to look after, whether you want me or not, whether you've been kind to me or cruel. That's what it means, Bram, to take a family. You don't get to pick the parts of it that are good to you. You take all of it, and you love all of it, and you sit by the worst of them at 2 in the morning, same as the best." She smoothed the blanket. "I never came to take your mother's place. No one could, and I'd never try. I just came to add a little more love to a house that had room for it, and there was room for you in it from the first day, even when you were doing your level best to throw me out the door." Bram Stroud broke down then, all the way. The grief he'd been guarding for 9 years, and the shame of 2 cruel months pouring out of him at once. And Lydia held the hand of the man who'd hated her while he wept, the way a mother holds a son. And that was the moment the long winter turned. The 5 other brothers came around in the days that followed, one and then another, their hostility crumbling now that Bram's had. For they'd taken their lead from him in the cruelty, and they took it from him in the surrender too. The cold suppers got eaten now with thanks. The turned backs turned around. The big house on the Aspen Fork, which had been a cold and grieving place for 9 years, began for the first time since Naomi died to feel like a home again, warm and full, and held together at its center by a woman who'd refused to be driven off. It was young Gil, the baby of them at 20, who said the word first, careless and natural, calling across the supper table for her to pass the bread. "Ma, hand me thee," and stopping, stricken, realizing what he'd said, going red, looking to his brothers in a panic. And there was a silence, and then Bram, from the chair where he sat with his mending leg, said quietly, "Leave it, Gil. It fits. It's what she's been to us since January, whether we'd say it or not." And he looked at Lydia, and he said it himself, deliberately, the eldest giving his brothers permission. "Pass Gil the bread, mother." And Elias Stroud at the head of his own table, surrounded by the 6 sons, and the wife he'd been so afraid could never share a roof, had to look down at his plate a long moment so the boys wouldn't see their old father cry. By the time the deep snows broke that spring, it was simply the truth of the house, spoken and settled. The 6 Stroud sons called Lydia mother, and meant it, and there was not one of them who could any longer imagine the Aspen Fork without her. She had not replaced Naomi. She had never tried. She had only done the thing Elias had hoped against hope she might. Given his sons a mother's love again in their grown years, and given his old age a warmth he'd thought was behind him, and made one family out of the cold and broken pieces that had been rattling around that big house for 9 lonely years. Elias lived another 12 good years, warm ones, and when he finally passed, it was Lydia's hand he held, and his 6 sons around the bed, a family whole and grieving together, as a family should. And the sons saw their stepmother through her own old age after that, with a devotion that answered 10 times over the cruelty of that first hard winter. Because she had taught them, by refusing to be run off, the truest thing there is to know about a family, that you don't get to pick the parts that are good to you. You take all of it. And sometimes the woman you swear to run off by sundown turns out, by the time the snows break, to be the very heart the whole house had been missing all along, and the only name that fits her, in the end, is the one you fought hardest never to give her: Mother.